The Goodyear Welt is probably one of the biggest buzzwords in the world of men's shoes today. Companies use it to sell you their shoes as a point of how well made they are. They use a Goodyear Welt. And a lot of people just don't know what that means. What is a Goodyear Welt? Well, today I'm going to answer that question along with showing you a bunch of other different types of shoe construction because each one has its pros and cons. Yes, some are better than others, and overall, I'd say Goodyear welting is probably one of the best methods of shoe construction. However, if you're looking for a very flexible shoe, for example, the Goodyear Welt is not going to give you the most flexible shoe. So each one has its pros and cons. We're going to go into all of those. We're going to start with what you came here to see, the Goodyear Welt. In order to explain the Goodyear Welt properly, it's very important that we're familiar with the different parts of a shoe. This here is the upper. What you're looking at when you see a shoe on a rack, and most likely what you bought the shoe for, is the upper. That's all of this leather here. Now it is divided into different sections, but just for argument's sake today, let's just call this portion the upper. The insole is the part right here in the bottom that your foot actually rests against. That's this piece of leather right here, the one that will kind of conform to your foot over time. Hopefully it's made out of a nice piece of leather. That's the insole. The outsole is this right here. This is the piece of leather that comes in contact with the ground. So these three different portions here are more or less what loosely makes up your shoe. Now the welt is a thin piece of leather which runs around the perimeter of the outsole. That's the welt. So when you talk about the Goodyear Welt, that's what they're talking about. When they're talking about something like a Blake stitch, there is no welting on a Blake stitch, but let's go into the Goodyear Welt a little bit more. The easiest way to tell if your shoes are Goodyear welted is if you look on the bottom and you can see a line of stitching, and then you look on the top and you can also see a line of stitching here. Now be careful because some companies will try to fool you. For example, this one right here, this is a Stafford, I believe this is the Gunner boot. This is a great boot for the price. I think it's around 50 bucks on sale. Not too bad, but if you look here, it almost looks like there's a little bit of stitching. That's actually rubber meant to look like a Goodyear welt. So you really have to kind of look. If you looked at the bottom, you can see the stitching there, and you look at the top there, you say, oh yeah, look, it's Goodyear welted. You have to look very closely to see the actual stitches going through. Now I mentioned cork. The other thing that the Goodyear Welt allows a manufacturer to do is it creates a cavity right here, and the manufacturer can actually put a layer of cork on the inside there between the outsole and the insole. This over time will compress and mold to your foot, which is the reason that nice shoes become more comfortable over time because they really become customized to your foot and the way you walk. The other benefit to the Goodyear Welt is that it's relatively water resistant. I wouldn't call it waterproof. You really wouldn't want to use something like this to go bouncing around in the woods or standing in water, but it's pretty waterproof because there's nothing here that allows the water to go directly from the outsole or whatever it is that you're standing on to the inside of the shoe the way a Blake stitch does. Some of the cons of the Goodyear Welt is that due to that construction and how robust it is, they can be stiff in the beginning. They do take a little bit of breaking in. So if you're looking for the most flexible shoe, this is not it. It does take a little bit of time to wear in, but that's to be expected. Another con to the Goodyear Welt is this very pronounced lip that you'll see. This isn't a really good example because Allen Edmonds does a great job of really tucking it in. But if you look at companies like Grant Stone, they have a very pronounced lip that goes around the outside. You may like this, you may not. It's sort of a matter of opinion, but that's one of the things that could be considered a con to the Goodyear Welt. Overall, it's probably the best method of shoe construction, but hey, let's be fair, there are pros and cons to each. Now, since I just talked about it, we're gonna bring up the Stafford Gunner boot again. This here is a very good example of a glued sole. So what you have here is you have the upper, you have the insole, and what you have is this outsole right here, which is essentially glued on to the shoe. Now, this is actually a very good method of construction when it comes to rubber soles. So your Nikes that you have at home, those are glued. There's no way those are Goodyear welted. And what that allows is a very flexible shoe, as you can tell right here. They're very, very flexible, which makes it very comfortable. It's very inexpensive, which is the reason that I could pick these up for $50. And it is possible to resole a glued or cemented shoe. I know a lot of people want to tell you that it's not possible, and it's not always possible, but there are some specialty shops that only do resoling of glued shoes. However, the consensus is that for 50 bucks or however much that cheaper shoe costs you, you're probably better off just buying a new one. The big con to the glued or cemented sole is delamination. Now, this is becoming less and less an issue as the adhesives get better and better, but there are times where this outsole will actually kind of just become unstuck and your shoe will be talking to you because the sole is flapping around from the upper. That does happen. I've had it happen before. That will not happen with a nicely stitched shoe, but it's one of the drawbacks of the cemented shoe construction. Another method of construction that's very popular is what they call the Blake stitch. And you'll find this a lot of times in Italian footwear. Italians like to do things very sleek and very streamlined, and their shoes are no different. So a good example of that is this pair of Paul Evans Double Monk boots. And I reviewed these a while ago. They are pretty expensive. I think they're a little bit too expensive for what you get. However, they're a very nice boot and a great example of the Blake stitch. Now, if you look here on the top, one of the easiest ways to tell is you do not see any stitching along the outside here. There's no welt. This is just a flat piece here. So when you look at the outsole, you don't see any of that telltale stitching that you'll see on a Goodyear welted shoe. Now, the way a Blake stitched pair of shoes is made is the stitching that connects the outsole here to the upper actually goes through and inside of the outsole. So if you can imagine right here, this actually gets stitched on the inside of the shoe right like that. One of the problems with this method of construction, however, is that this will pick up moisture from the ground and it will wick through the stitches that go here onto the inside of your shoe. So they're not very water resistant. They're also very flexible because they don't have all of that heavy-duty construction that the Goodyear Welt has, and they are resoleable as long as the cobbler has a Blake stitch machine. Now, I understand that this can be done by hand, but could you imagine trying to get your hand in there to resole a Blake stitch? It would be really hard to do. One of the other cons, and I've never actually heard of it happening to anyone, but supposedly, since this is stitched on the insole, it can be irritating to some feet because you have the threads underneath your foot there. Now, I'm sure they're not as pronounced as you would imagine them to be there. If any company does it well, I'm sure that they hide them very well. But that could be a problem for somebody, especially if you have sensitive feet. So keep that in mind. There's a slightly modified version of the Blake stitch called Blake Rapid, which essentially stitches the upper to a midsole instead of stitching it directly to the outsole here. And that allows for almost a hybrid of Goodyear welting and Blake stitching. These are more weather resistant than the Blake stitch, however, they're not as weather resistant as the Goodyear Welt. One isn't really better than the other. If you're looking for a very sleek look, well, then you gotta go with a Blake stitch. If you want something that is easily resolable and maybe a little bit more rugged, well, then the Goodyear Welt is the one for you. They're both great. A lot of times people have a tendency to kind of belittle the Blake stitch or the Blake Rapid stitch. And really, they're just two different things meant for two different ways of wearing your shoes and two different lifestyles. Another method of shoe construction, however, not nearly as popular as Blake stitching, Goodyear welting, or cementing, is the Norwegian Storm welt, which I have on this pair of Red Wings right here. And what makes this different, as you can see, there's a very pronounced welt right here. And what you have is you have a piece of leather, which makes up the welt, that actually kind of forms an L. And furthermore, the upper is actually turned up at the edges and then stitched back to itself. And what this makes is a very, very waterproof shoe and a very hardy and rugged look. So as you can see, these are a pair of work boots. And you will find these, however, on dress shoes, but most of the time you'll see them with a double row of stitching at the top, and it's really more decorative than anything. It's kind of something that if you have every other kind of shoe out there and what you really want is something different, well, a Norwegian Storm welt can really deliver that uniqueness to your shoe. Now, the pro to this is that it's very water resistant. The con is the same as the Goodyear welt. There's a lot of stitching, a lot of material up here, so it makes for a much less flexible shoe. So this is the Norwegian Storm welt, something you won't really see that often, and it's a very specialized kind of construction. One of the shoe construction methods that I do not own is what they call Bologna construction. If you can imagine your foot and then the piece of leather wrapping around and then being stitched along the bottom and then connected to an outsole, that's what Bologna construction is. This is also known as tubular construction, where they're essentially wrapping your foot with leather, stitching it, and then putting a sole on it. Now, this is the most flexible kind of shoe. If what you're after is flexibility, this is what you want. The cons are it's not very durable, has the same moisture wicking problems as the Blake stitch, and they're not very supportive. These are the most popular methods of shoe construction. And based on that, is the Goodyear welt what you're really after? Yeah, sure, they're great, but if you're really after flexibility, then maybe this isn't exactly the way you want to go. Another thing that I forgot to mention about the Goodyear welt is that it's not always a big 360-degree welt. A great example of that is this pair of Aldens right here. This is called a 270-degree welt. So the welt actually stops somewhere back in here. And what that allows them to do is really cut this sole very closely to the heel and make a nice sleek look. This still has all of the great properties of a Goodyear welt. It is a true Goodyear welt, however, it's just a different type of Goodyear welt. This is a 270-degree Goodyear welt. This is a 360-degree Goodyear welt. So even within the different methods, there are subdivisions. And it's much more complicated than I've simplified it to be here. However, unless you're really building a shoe, I don't think it really needs to be explored that much more in depth. Yes, the Goodyear welt is excellent. It is my preferred method of shoe construction. However, it's not this insane, crazy, oh, this is what we've all been working towards all these years kind of thing. A lot of times, the companies that are trying to sell you their shoes will have you believe that. However, it is an excellent method of shoe construction. Not the only one out there, and it might not be the best one for your needs, but it is an excellent method of shoe construction. And a lot of times, just to put Goodyear welted, you know that the company is investing some serious money in the way that they're building their shoes. I hope this has been an informative video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next time.